Hello, everyone. I'm Dennis Taylor, and in this session, we'll be talking about formulas and functions, certainly the centerpiece of what many people do as they work with Excel. We assume you know something about formulas, and you probably used a function or two at the minimum. And I just want to give you a quick reminder as we start here, too. One of the most common problems with formulas, and sometimes it's just a question of oversight, but for beginners, it's always a bit of a problem until you get used to the concept. The way Excel calculates data sometimes surprises people. It doesn't work the same way the way a standard calculator works. And a simple little example like what we see on the screen is going to remind us of this situation. We've got a total here in row 15 for various entries for the different regions here, and we simply want to track the percentage change. Now, we have no December number, so cell right here, B17 will be empty, but in the next cell to the right, we simply want to calculate the percent of increase. Simple little formula, and a lot of you can do it in your head. We need to subtract those two, that's going to be 15, then divide by what we started with, that's 30, and of course our answer is going to be 0.5 or 50%. 50% growth. Some of us can do that in our heads, and that's fine. Some of the other numbers maybe not so easily. But how do we start with this? Equal, and you can either type or click C15 minus B15, and then divide that by our starting number, which is B15. And if you didn't know any better, you'd probably do that, and as soon as you press enter, you'd be a bit appalled and scratching your head and couldn't figure out what was going on. But if you have worked with Excel, of course, you know the problem. And let me zoom into. I will zoom in and out at different times using the control key and the mouse wheel. I like to make things large and clear. So as I double click on here and take a look at this, I think a lot of you do know what's happening. What does Excel do when it sees a formula like this? It looks for parentheses, doesn't see any of those. It looks for multiplication and division before addition and subtraction. So it essentially performs this calculation first. That's a 1, of course, and C15 minus 1, or 45 minus 1 is 44. That's how we get the answer. And of course, many of you know what to do. We need to put in parentheses right here, a left parent and then a right parent to indicate that we want what's done in the parentheses first. And it's an easy fix, and most people get used to it. And we did learn how to do that back in the 6th grade, didn't we? To eliminate any ambiguity about how things were happening. The order of precedence, it's called. And a lot of people, until they get used to this, maybe they compensate by putting in more parentheses that are needed. Usually this is not a problem, although it does clutter up the formulas. From time to time, that's going to work just as well. But in either case, it's 0.5. And of course, what a lot of us would do immediately is use the percent button up there, or a nice keystroke shortcut, Control-Shift% sign. That's Control-Shift-5, same thing. And so that's going to be handy. So in this case here right now, an extra set of parentheses won't matter, and take off the front ones. Many times, of course, when you work with formulas in Excel, you forget a parentheses. Like if I forget this one now, Excel often makes a guess as I press enter right here. And some of you have encountered this, but notice, by the way, it doesn't really get it right. It puts the parentheses in the wrong time. I'd say most of the time, I'd say probably 90% of the time, when Excel makes a guess, it gets it right. But again, in this case, it doesn't. So from time to time, you will have to deal with these. And sometimes you get formulas from other sources, and they're extremely long, and you just got to sit down and figure out those parentheses. When you do have multiple parentheses, by the way, too, you will see that they're color-coded, and you probably encounter that if you've worked with formulas very much. So just a few thoughts on some basic ideas there. You may or may not have this on paper, or even in your head, but think of this as the order of precedence, top down. Anytime Excel sees a formula, it looks for parentheses first. It does what's inside the parentheses and then proceeds to do other things too. The caret symbol, raising numbers to powers, is then sought out, and if it's not there, it just moves down to here. And if there are asterisks and slashes within the same formula, Excel simply does them left to right. So just a quick reminder of that feature. Now, many of you use Autosum, and that's a great tool. On this worksheet here, a couple of quick reminders about how we can do this more efficiently. Certainly nothing wrong with the Autosum button. It's found in 2 locations in the ribbon menu system. Now, I am using Excel 2013. If you're using a prior version, most of what we say in this session is going to work the same in all. There are a few new formulas, a few new functions. There are a few new functions that we can bring out a bit later. The Autosum button is found on the right side of the Home tab. We see it right there. Or if you're on the Formulas tab, the left side, a bit more prominent. And just a quick reminder, a great keystroke shortcut for this is Alt equal. So in cell G2, I've positioned it there. I'll press Alt equal, and then simply enter. You can also, if you use the button, double-click Autosum, and you can get the same answer. Remember, too, when you highlight cells like these, you can do this ahead of time, and that means you can click Autosum once or press Alt-equal and be done. Either way, you can do it that way, too. And recognize, too, that you might have an occasional case of what we might call ambiguity here. Situation here, we've got numbers there and numbers there. What's Autosum going to do here? Autosum always looks upward first before looking leftward. So if we were to press Alt-equal or the Autosum button, Excel will look upward first. And of course, if we really want to add the numbers to the left, we'll simply use the mouse and highlight these 3 cells to the left and enter. So we can easily redirect that too. So pretty standard. Keep in mind too, when you're working with formulas in parallel situations, you can enter multiple formulas in parallel situations at once. So if, for example, here, if we wanted to do averages, or let's say medians for either of these, something like this, we can highlight these cells here to the left first, and then using the control key, highlight these cells to the right. For the moment, the active cell is in R8, but if we were to type equal average, left parenthesis, it looks as if we're only doing an average for column R, and we do this also to further at least give that impression as to what we're doing. If we were to press enter, of course, we would only be putting in the average for cell R8, but if we press control enter, we get the same relative formula in all these cells at the same time. And by the way, that could have been done faster, so I'll press Control Z to undo it. After highlighting these, we could, using the Autosum button, either of its locations, use the drop arrow for Autosum, and there's average right there. So we can choose average there and get our average done that way. But other functions, for example, median, we'd have to type them in, just as I did earlier with average. So some quick methods there. And when you've got other scenarios where you've got formulas and potential formulas in parallel situations, you will need at different times to, or you not won't need, but you can take advantage of that by using the idea of writing formulas in multiple locations, pressing Control Enter. Of course, in all those cases too, you select the cells where the formulas are going to be entered first, then you write the formula, then you press Control Enter. Now, there are times too when you want to change data. Suppose these numbers here are off. Maybe a mistake was made in the creation of them, and you know that they're off by 10, for example. You want to make them all bigger by 10 or smaller, either way. All you need to do is put 10 in a nearby cell temporarily. Later you can get rid of it, and simply copy it. You can right-click copy or Control C, and we want to bump all these up by 10 so we can highlight these cells here. Go right into Paste Special. One way to do this is right-click Paste Special. You can do it that way. And in the Paste Special dialog box, in this case, we'll simply choose Add and OK. And they're all going to be bigger by 10. So that 33 in the upper left corner will be 43, and the 40 number to the right of course, will be 50, and so on. There we are. Easy, fast. And then get rid of the 10. We don't need it anymore. And there are no formulas there in sight. So there's no paper trail. In some cases, you might need that or want that, but there's no indication as to what these numbers were earlier. In some cases, that's just fine. Another situation, maybe we're at the end of the year, and this represents last year's or just the current year that just finished. You want to project an improvement next year, maybe a 5% improvement for all these numbers. We'd want to multiply them all by 1.05. So put that in a nearby cell. Now, possibly here we might have to do some formatting, but that'll be okay. So 1.05, we'll put that in the nearby cell and copy that, Control C, highlight these cells. And a faster way to get to Paste Special is Control Alt V, using that same V that you might have been familiar with Paste, but Control Alt V activates the Paste Special dialog box. And this time it's a multiply. Okay, there we are. And we can see what that is. And if that displays okay, fine. It's using general format, so the decimals appear when needed. If you want to standardize this, one quick way could be, if you want to use the keystroke shortcut, it would be Control Shift exclamation point is one. That's one option. And then you could go to the Home tab and decide how many decimals you want right here. Possibly that. But anyway, these are 5% bigger than they used to be. And this number out here we don't need anymore. So that's handy at times too. You can imagine the power we might have in Other worksheets will take everybody's salaries and just increase them by 2,500, something like that. You can easily add on to data this way. Now, sometimes you encounter long formulas. I've got a worksheet here that's pretty bad, and I've made it worse over the years. But I use it as an example of what happens sometimes. Maybe someone was pulling good information together here, just didn't get a chance to format it better, align it better, and maybe that person moved on to a different job or something. It's in your lap now, and you've got to figure out what's going on. It would be handy if we knew which cells had formulas here. Now, if you click on a single cell, Excel will allow you to look everywhere. So we're about to go to the Home tab, rightmost button, Find and Select. And by the way, if you did have 2 cells or 3 cells or 4 cells selected, Excel will only look within the highlighted range. So in a counterintuitive way here, let's just click on a single cell, but we're about to select, or better expressed, we are about to look in or search within just the current worksheet, but the entire worksheet. Under Find and Select to the right, we've got a choice called Formulas. We choose Formulas, and those are all the formula cells in this worksheet. And if we like to highlight them in color, fine. Over to the left of the Home tab in the font group here, we've got our fill color bucket. I'll just use yellow since it's there anyway, and that's fine. We can do that. If you'd like to highlight just the numerical cells, a little bit longer, not exactly a shortcut, but we can get there with Find and Select also. That same button off to the right. And here too, before you start this, make sure that the active cell is in one cell only, not multiple cells. Find and Select, Go to Special, and in the Go to Special dialog box, we want to choose constants, but let's, under formulas here, uncheck the box for text, logicals, and errors, and click OK. So these are the cells that have pure numbers. Possibly we might want to highlight those maybe in blue or whatever, some other color. So as long as you remember your color scheme, that's handy at times, particularly when you're getting used to a worksheet trying to figure out what's going on. The feature is not dynamic, so if you do erase this cell, for example, it's going to stay yellow. Or if you put in a new formula here, it's not going to turn yellow. So from time to time, you'd want to run those 2 features again to get the colors in place. If you want to keep them, that is. So they're not required, but it is handy at times to see that. Now, another tool that's going to be helpful too is just being able to see the formulas quickly. You can, of course, double click on a cell. Is that a formula? Well, we can look in the formula bar first, I guess. But is that a formula right there? We can see it in the formula bar. We can double click and see it's a formula. How about this one here? That one is too, and so on. So sometimes that's handy, but how about seeing them all at once? Now, it's not wrong to have the color here, but I think because it might be distracting right here, I'll just click in the upper left-hand corner, and on this fill color bucket right here, I'll simply choose no fill. All right, let's imagine we wanted to see all the formulas in the worksheet on the screen at once. In cell C1 right here, I'm going to zoom in on it. I've depicted one of the keys that in most keyboards, at least in the US, is in the upper left-hand corner. That top symbol is called tilde, and most books, if they refer to it at all, call the other symbol accent grave, which is used in French, usually over the letter E. And anyway, whether you use those symbols or not, we don't know what to call that key, or a lot of us don't. I'm going to call it tilde. Do not use the Shift key, but when you press Control tilde, let me zoom back a little bit. When you press Control tilde without the Shift key, you get this kind of a display. All the column widths have been doubled. That's to give you a better opportunity to probably see the entire formula, which is going to be true most of the time. Doubles the width of columns as it exposes formulas, like this, and so on. And there, we see formulas everywhere. If you were about to print this too, it might not be a bad idea to temporarily readjust the column widths. When I go to Print Preview, by way of Control F2, it kind of looks like that. It would probably look better too if you jump into Page Setup and make sure that on the Sheet tab here you show the grid lines. It'll probably make it simpler. And in addition too, if you want to use this as a source of documentation, go back to Page Setup, and also in this same Sheet tab here, right back here, show the row and column headings. In other words, the column letters and the row numbers. And again, that could be a good source of documentation. In other words, this is how the worksheet looks when the formulas are displayed. And so that's going to be handy at times. You don't necessarily, of course, have to print this. Nevertheless, handy, and it's a toggle, Control tilde, back and forth. It is represented in the ribbon menu system. However, when they refer you to the keystroke shortcut, you can easily overlook it or miss it. So on the Formulas tab, we've got a button right here, Show Formulas. As you slide over that, the pop-up tip below it does refer to the other key. In a certain sense, that's right, because typically when you see formulas, if it's not the uppercase character, they don't use the shift word there at all. So it says Show Formulas, Control plus that other symbol, whatever you want to call it. So it's easily overlooked. Anyway, I think it's a great tool, and I use it anytime I'm doing worksheet troubleshooting. I just do it routinely. It causes no damage. Sometimes it's very revealing. At other times, it doesn't do a whole lot. It just depends upon the situation. Now, when you are working with certain formulas at different times, suppose I've got a situation here. Maybe one of these formulas here, doesn't make any difference which one really. I'm having problems with it. I know that number's wrong. Sometimes you have a gut instinct, or you just kind of have a feel for the numbers. You know that number's wrong. I'm going to zoom in on it. When you're editing a formula, and you can do it by double-clicking, or you can, of course, go into the toolbar, into the formula bar up above, you can evaluate this in pieces if you wish. Now, if I knew what this total was here, it might help me decide whether my formula has been set up properly. So I'm going to highlight these cells here. This is while editing, and press the F9 key. Now, maybe right away a light bulb goes off, and I say, you know, that number is way too high. There's something wrong there. Let me go check out the other data. Now, if you want to start evaluating other portions of this, you're either going to have to press Escape and come back in again, or press Control-Z to undo this last action. There we are. Now, could it possibly be this number? And we can see it nearby anyway. Probably wouldn't do it there. If I press F9 right now, it's simply going to show me the 132. We can see that up above, so that wouldn't be a great use of it there. You want to be careful when you do these too, not to press Enter in the middle of all this, because sometimes you will have wiped your formula out, but then you can undo it, of course. Now, at different times, depending upon the formula too, if you highlight an incoherent piece of it, now if I somehow highlight that part of it, that just doesn't make any sense in terms of trying to pick that out as a piece. And so if I use F9 in this case, it comes back with a totally irrelevant message about a problem with the formula and so on and so on and so on. Simply ignore it and start over again. But I certainly found that useful in longer formulas. And by the way, if you're working with formulas that have logicals in them, I think I've got one down here. Yeah, here's one. If I want to know, is that true or is that false, I can highlight this. Of course, that's not a calculation. That's a test. So if I press F9 right here, it says true. And of course, that gives me some insight into how this function is working as well too. So at different times, you can highlight different portions of this. Once again, coming back in here, maybe it's just this chunk that's important. Now, that's a lot, and I got to be careful too to be highlighting a coherent piece of that. And I'll take that piece and highlight it and press F9. Okay, there it is. And maybe include this part now and press F9. Oh yeah, that's way off. Let me get out of here and rethink this. What do? Press Escape. So that's going to be handy at times in helping you figure out what's wrong with the formula. It's a debugging tool. The F9 key while editing. Now, another important auditing tool is also found on the Formulas tab. And notice there is a group here called Formulas Auditing, the Formula Auditing group here. Now, it's real important to me, after working with this worksheet for 10 or 15 minutes or so, to recognize that if I change B3, I know it's going to have some big impact because I've seen it referred to in a few formulas. But I really need to know the ultimate impact. If I change B3, which other cells will change? So I'm looking for the dependence of this cell. Here's a button called Trace Dependence. I'm going to click it. And that immediately shows me cells that have formulas in them that relate back to B3. So if I click on cell G5 over here, up in the formula bar, it refers to B3. If I click off to the right in cell L20, I also see B3 referred to there. And of course, I can see it here too. There's B3. But you don't want to stop on after just having clicked Trace Dependence once, and make sure you keep your active cell in place. In fact, normally when you do this, you want to click it rapidly. I'm going to click Trace Dependence again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And if my speaker is on at some point, it'll beep, or if it's not, the lines will stop appearing. So I've either got my work cut out for me, or I'm appalled, or I'm thrilled, depending upon the scenario here. But all of these cells that have arrows or blue dots in them have a dependency on B3. And of course, in some cases, it's 2 or 3 formulas removed. There's a formula over here in L9. It doesn't say anything about B3, but it's getting data from cell E5, which is getting data from B3, and so on. Now, you can't say flat out that if you change B3, all of these others will change, but you certainly can say if I change B3, all of these other cells could and might change. Not 100%, because we don't know the formulas necessarily. And you might also recognize an unusual visual on the screen. There's a dashed line there. Now, if I move down to cell G5, that's where it's coming out of. It's kind of hard to see, but it's coming out of G5. There's nothing in that formula that raises any question. It says equal B7 times E5 plus B3. But we're checking for dependencies. And what this dashed line means is we've got a dependency on another worksheet in this workbook or in another open workbook right now. So if you double click the dashed line, as I'm doing right now, we can see on another worksheet called Formulas and Functions, or I'm sorry, it's called Profits, but it's in this worksheet, it's in this current workbook, which is called Formulas and Functions, in cell K1. Now we can double click this, it'll take us right to it, or click it once and click OK. It's going to take us to the other sheet, and we'll see a formula over there. So here's a formula on another worksheet right here. Double click. It says get data from cell G5 in that other worksheet that we just came from. So again, going back to that worksheet, the worksheet is called Find Formulas. This worksheet is getting data from, or let's say, let me phrase it the correct way. This worksheet's data is being used elsewhere. Now ask yourself this question. How can you know at a glance if some of these cells are being used elsewhere? You really can't figure that out unless you just happen to check that cell's dependencies. So we're coming up with information here that would be hard pressed to come by. And you might say we discovered it by accident here. In other words, we're checking the dependencies of B3, and ultimately we realize a change to B3 could have impact on that other sheet. So it's just a question of how well you know this workbook, and this brings out some of the dependencies that we might have here too. Now, if we're going to start checking the dependencies of another cell here, we better get rid of these, or it's just going to be total chaos. Our screen's going to be a mess. And by the way, if it's important, and it could be for some of these cells, if you want to keep the visual here, I'm going to press Control F2. Our print preview will contain these as well too. So keep that in mind at times. What I sometimes jokingly say in live sessions here, as soon as you do this, print this to show that you've been busy. It looks like you've done a lot of work, although you really haven't in this case. Let me remove the arrows. There's a button up there for remove arrows. And think of the reverse situation, which could be equally or more important, depending upon the circumstances. I've got a total here in L23. Suppose it's the bottom line total. And if someone says, how did you get this number? Where does it come from? It's got a simple little formula that's simply going to pick up the maximum of 2 different cells. But those cells have formulas. So let's work backwards, so to speak. Let's work the other direction. And the term here is called precedence. We want to trace precedence. So up in the Formulas tab in the Formula Auditing group, I've got the active cell in L23. I'm going to trace precedence. Click it once, twice, 3 times. Keep clicking it. There we go. And I'll zoom back a little bit. Now, here too, and maybe not as busy as the last one perhaps, but we see all the interrelationships in this particular worksheet. And we also see here, although it's not always the case, but same idea here, we've got a dashed line, and that means we've got a formula. Looks like it's coming out of cell B19. There's a formula in B19, and I'll double click it. The formula is getting data from another worksheet. And there too, we could double click the dashed line, or just at least see it. Maybe just click the dashed line, double click it. And we see that too is related to that same other sheet, but in a different sense. This is getting data from cell A19 in the other worksheet. And so when we see cell A19 over here, nothing unusual about that. It's just a number, but it's being used in the other worksheet. So these are the kinds of things that if you ever tried to do something like this manually, I mean, it's almost unthinkable. Almost unthinkable. I don't envy anybody who has to do auditing of worksheets, and yet at certain times they're necessary, and sometimes it provides that additional documentation that really helps if you've got a complex worksheet. So once again, if we wanted to check the precedence of another cell, we'd probably want to get rid of these lines first, or if we want to just move on and do other things, remove the arrows there. Now, let's move more into formulas, actual creation and usage of formulas, and then, of course, into functions as well. In a different worksheet here, I've got a situation here where I simply want to calculate a new compensation amount. And in this example here, I'll zoom in and scroll to the right a little bit. Everybody's going to get a 2.91% increase. Here's their current compensation amount. We're going to calculate a new one. And, of course, the concern here is we're going to write a formula, copy it down the column. But as we do this, we want to make sure that our reference to cell P1 stays the same. And a poor solution would be to fill in column P with this same number over and over and over. And any number of different ways to write the formula. Certainly one way would be equal L2 times this P1 value. Now, if we want to make sure that this does not change, we need to make it absolute. We can either put $sign in front of the P and the 1, or simply, at this moment, press the function key F4 to make that an absolute address. Remember, that's not intuitive, and the reason we use $signs probably goes way back in spreadsheet history, because probably other software use it. So we don't care necessarily where that's coming from, but by no means let's not mistake this for meaning currency. It has nothing to do with currency, although in this case we are in a numerical type column, currency type column. Okay, that would calculate the amount of the increase. We simply want to add on to this the compensation. And that's certainly going to give us an answer. I'm going to press Control Enter here so the active cell will not move downward. Looks like that. Keep in mind, another way, a common way to do this, some people find it more convincing. How about a left parenthesis and then 1 plus? Or some people put the +1 after this. So we'll get the same answer this way. Just a question, what is clear to you? It's as if we're saying, take the old salary and multiply it by 102.91%. Different way of saying it, perhaps. Whatever's closest to your way of thinking, either way is going to work. Same answer. And we'd like to copy this down the column. It's always good to test these out for a little bit and make sure you got your absolute addressing in shape. The numbers are looking good. Let's double click one of these or simply look in the formula bar. Either way, we recognize that the P1 is absolute. It's not going to change. In a strict sense, in this example, since we're only copying the formula downward, the column reference would never change anyway, so in a strict sense, we really don't need the $sign in front of the P, but it doesn't hurt, so we'll move on. And the fastest way to copy this down the column is not by dragging, although that's pretty fast, depending upon the length of these. I've got 700 rows or so here. I'm going to double-click the lower right-hand corner. Now, a not so well-known shortcut, but a handy one here. Rather than scrolling to the bottom to make sure this got copied all the way, let's just press Control period. And you might scroll a bit beyond that just to make sure it goes to the bottom. Anytime you press Control period, it simply moves the active cell around the corners of the range. By the way, if you ever explain that in a vacuum or in an isolated case, it seems like a ridiculous shortcut. Here's a range of cells. Let's press Control period. That's all Control period does. And if it's in a single column, like the current case here, it simply does this. And, why would you ever use it? Well, we just saw the perfect use of it. We copy this. We want to make sure it got copied all the way. Press Control period a few times to verify the extent of the copy. Great shortcut. Comes in handy. So at different times, though, you might have a situation where you need to use that $sign in a different way. Here's a simple little scenario here. We need a bunch of formulas here simply to calculate these items. Now, these are items that need to be distributed. 20% of these are going to go to the east, so that's going to be, 180? And most of these, we can do the math in our heads. We're going to distribute these. These numbers, of course, add up to 100. And how do we know that quickly? We can look in the status bar at the bottom of the screen. The status bar will display these numbers. If you see no display, or maybe you're only seeing 1 or 2 items, these are going to be triggered anytime you highlight two or more cells, and two or more numerical cells, if you right-click the status bar at the bottom of the screen down here, you will see within this section 6 different statistical measures. I often have them all on, and usually I don't change them very much. Why not have them all on? Even though many times what I care about is the sum and the average and not much else, but still, it's handy anytime you highlight 2 or more cells to get this information. In this case, it's just a quick reminder, our numbers are adding up to 100%. All right, a simple little formula here, equal and in no particular order, this cell times that cell. And we get a correct answer. But I think most of you know ahead of time, as soon as we copy this downward, we've got problems. If we copy it to the right, we've got problems too, in a different way. Both of them are just not going to work. So I'll just press Control-Z a couple of times. There are different ways to approach this, but just take one of these cells at random, say this one. And here's a statement we could make that would be a fair statement. And we could say about other cells as well too. Whatever this formula is, it must refer to row 3. That's true, it's got to get its percentages. It must refer to column B, that's where the quantities come out of. So if we go back to the very first formula that we wrote, now you wouldn't know this intuitively either, but I'm going to click in front of the C3 or inside of it or after it, any place out there. Say we're about to deal with C3. If we start to press the F4 key repeatedly, it goes through different variations. Now, what you wouldn't know instinctively is whatever follows the $ is what remains absolute. Now, if this is the portion of our formula that refers to the percentages, we want to make sure that we always see row 3. So we want a $ in front of the 3. But not all the percentages are going to come out of column C all the time. So we don't want a $ in front of the C. Now, you can certainly do this manually too. You could put the $ in front of the 3 alone. But if you press F4 repeatedly, it cycles through through the 4 variations that we might want at different times. So C $3 is what we want. And then to the right here, this is the portion of our formula that refers to quantity. The quantities will always come out of column B. So here too, we'll press F4 repeatedly until we see a variation where the $ is in front of the B, but not in front of the row number. So that's going to be our master formula. We could press Control-Enter here, double-click to copy it downward, and then drag it across. And all of these appear to be correct. And the math is so easy in this example, we can do the math in our heads and quickly verify this. So I'll just click here as an example and double-click, and we can see clearly what's going on. The formula, of course, is correct. It's always referring to row 3 to get our percentages. Every formula here must refer to column B for the amounts. So mixed references, not nearly as common, but occasionally pretty common. And I remember doing this way back in the days of Lotus 1, 2, 3 and having a large list here that had about 80 items down the left-hand side and about 15 across the top. And it's pretty powerful, but not intuitive until you get used to the concept. Even then, calling it intuitive is a bit of a stretch. You just got to get used to the idea of what those $ mean. Idea is an example of a mixed reference. So sometimes we have absolute references, sometimes mixed references, and sometimes just clear references, I guess you'd say. All right, when you do work with certain kinds of data too, it's going to be helpful to refer to entire column references. Now, the first few examples I'm going to use are pretty straightforward, but we will also use these as we work with certain functions as well. For example, here, if we want to find the total amount that we're spending on compensation now, we can simply click column M, and in the status bar at the bottom of the screen, this tells us we've got 44 million. We're spending 44.5 million on our compensation, our various salaries. And we've got full-time people and half-time and other kinds. So compensation, I guess, be the better word than salary that we're using here. Now, we want to know that total too. I mean, we can certainly click column M to see that, but maybe we want to have these numbers at our fingertips. And median, by the way, is not available in the status bar. So how about a quick calculation here? And as we were approaching this, you could certainly take advantage of Autosum. Now, a lot of people type equal sum, nothing wrong with that. But I want to say that anytime you type equal sum, Why didn't you press Autosum? Not that it's a huge time saver, but it already does that typing for you. And then you can plug in whatever numbers or locations you want. Why don't we just press Alt equal here? Obviously, we don't want to add some cells to the left. We want to add up all the data in column M. And rather than highlighting from M2 down to M699 or typing in something, let's just click column M. There it is, and enter, and we've got an answer. The notation might look strange to you, but you have to admit it's neat, it's tidy, and it has a major advantage over other uses of the sum function in that what if this list grows or shrinks? What do we do with the formula here? Nothing. It's going to work just fine. Now, of course, we do have to say that we want to make sure nothing else will appear in column M. Having the label on top is irrelevant, but we don't have any subtotals within the list, no grand total down below. That's just perfect. And again, if our list grows or shrinks, it's a great way to refer to certain formulas. Let's do this with average. And here we could take advantage of the drop arrow with Autosum. Click the drop arrow, choose average, click column M, and enter. Now, median isn't in that list. You'll have to type it. But remember, when you're typing function names, you don't need to capitalize them. In this case, too, we'll just click column M. And because we're only using a single function, we don't have to put in the right parent. Excel will do it for us. Enter, and we're all set. So those are good, quick, easy ways of using column references. Now, I've got another worksheet here called City Sales. And here I want to get an East total. I want to add up the New York and Boston data. Let me zoom in a little bit, see it a little bit better. And here too, same general approach, but this time we'll be selecting entire rows. And we would be sure and know ahead of time there's no other data in row 4 or any of these rows except out to column M. In other words, nothing to the right. Once again, Alt equal here, and I'll simply highlight rows 4 and 5 together, our two eastern cities for the example here, and enter. Look at the notation we see, 4:5. Enter, and there we are. Midwest total, a little bit different because our cities are not adjacent, but here too, we'll start with Alt equal, click row 7 for Chicago, a comma, and row 12 for Cincinnati, and enter. And in both of these cases too, we could easily, let me again redisplay that and zoom in a little bit. There we are. It looks funny, but it says, in effect, add up row 7, add up row 12, add them up together, gives our total. We could quickly verify that too up above simply by selecting row 12 and selecting row 7, and we see a total in our status bar, 1,478,783. That's the same number we're seeing here in B18, where we got that total. So using row references, although a lot less common, also is viable in certain situations. Now, sometimes you use formulas that get data from other worksheets, and we saw one example of that earlier, but let's take a somewhat longer example. I've got a different workbook here. It's called 4-State Sales. And here's a California sheet, a Texas sheet, New York, Florida, and you probably recognize immediately. They have exactly the same layout. And in fact, a bigger question might be, well, why are these on separate sheets? Couldn't we put them all on the same sheet? Well, we could, but let's imagine that the model here might grow. We might start dealing eventually with more items. We might have different sales outlets. We might have different states too, additionally. So even though that's potentially viable, there is merit for having identically laid out worksheets in separate worksheets rather than putting the data all in one. Now, let's imagine that ultimately what we want to do here is to create a summary sheet. There are two broad approaches here. One might be, let's just take one of our sheets like Florida and simply copy paste this data onto sheet 1, or how about an empty sheet, or sheet 2. Could we do that? We certainly could. The problem, and not a major one, is we'd have to readjust our column widths, and some of the colors might not be copied correctly and so on. So a better way, if we want to create a summary sheet, simply take one of our sheets like Florida and copy it. And if you hold down the control key, that's what I'm doing. I'm dragging Florida to the right, letting go of the mouse, and instantly we've got a copy. Identical in all respects, except for the name, which is now Florida 2. So we've got Florida looking like this, and as I click Florida 2, you're looking at the data, it seems to be not changing at all. So we made it a duplicate, easy. let's first order business here. Let's change the name of this Florida sheet, Florida 2, to summary. And we change the sheet name simply by double clicking. Type summary, enter. And up in cell A2, we're going to change that to be summary. Now the numbers are still left over from Florida, and for the moment we can leave them there. A quick reminder too, I'm going to press Control tilde. We'll see where the formulas are and where the pure numbers are. This is where the pure numbers are right here. The formulas are going to stay there. The formulas are going to stay there. I'll press Control tilde again. Now, we don't have to wipe them out, but I'm going to make column B wider and also zoom in too. Here's what we're about to do. We're going to change cell B4 here so that it's not a copy of the Florida data. It's going to be the sum of the California, Texas, New York, and Florida data. I'll make the column wider so we can see the result here more clearly. And I'm simply going to write a new formula. And I want to show you two different ways to do this. First way is equal, and I'm going to go to the California sheet and click cell B4. So we're trying to get the total for chairs retail. So I've just grabbed the California data, put in a plus. I'll go to Texas, click on that same cell there, plus, and then New York, click that cell on the plus, and then finally Florida. Click there, no final plus, and enter. So there's our total, looking like that. And not bad, only 4 sheets. As soon as we get to 6 sheets, 8 sheets, somewhere in this process, I think you begin to realize this is pretty tedious. And furthermore, are we going to get it perfect if we have 15 states or 20 states, or how about all 50, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? This is certainly viable, and there's nothing wrong with it. And remember, I did almost no typing. And I almost want to say, not as a flat-out rule, but don't be typing sheet names and formulas. Simply click on them. And you wouldn't know instinctively, and you see it here, we do have exclamation points behind the sheet names. And let me make a slight change here just to point out something too. In the New York sheet, I didn't put a space between New and York, but now I will. I'll double click New York and put a space in there. Now, this is neither good nor bad, but it does make certain formulas more complex looking. So I'll go back to the summary sheet where we wrote this first formula. And because New York has a space in it, now we see single quotes. That's even a stronger reason for saying don't type sheet names. Now, again, nothing wrong with this, but it does make the formula just a little bit more complex, a little tighter. And when I'm debugging other worksheets at different times that people have sent to me, when I look at formulas, sometimes I'll look at the sheet names. And again, although it's not wrong to have spaces in sheet names, I often will take them out just to simplify long formulas in terms of their appearance. So again, nothing truly wrong with that, but it just makes the formula look a bit longer, a bit more complex. We've got the single quotes in there because there's a space. Let me go back and I'll change that again. Back to New York at the bottom, double click, take out the space. But let's refocus on this formula. This formula works, it's accurate, we could copy it downward and rightward, but ultimately it's not the best way to do this. A formula like this, by the way, is often referred to as a 3D formula. But there's a better way to do these 3D formulas. And it involves one technique that you might be familiar with. It's not everybody is. Suppose, as we look at the layouts, I'm clicking California, Texas, New York, Florida. Suppose we wanted to change all of these so that we have an empty row between what is now row 2 and 3. If we want to do that 4 separate times, we could, but why not do all of them at once? How do we select 4 consecutive sheets? Click on a sheet at either end, in this case Florida. We'll do it that way. Hold down the Shift key. Let's click California. Very top of our screen, behind the file name says Group. So I'm going to right-click row 3 and Insert. Now, that happened not just on the Florida sheet. If I click New York, you see it's happened there. Texas, it's happened there. California, it's happened there. So that, you might say, save me some time. How do we ungroup? Click one of the non-grouped sheets, or simply right-click the current sheet and ungroup. Okay, so remembering that idea that we were able to select multiple sheets with the Shift key, let's go back to our summary formula here, but do this a different way. I'm going to start with Autosum, Alt equal. And now I'm going to select those first 4 sheets, California through Florida. Click on California, and now with the Shift key held down, click Florida. Now the formula is being built. You might be able to see it in the formula bar. It says equal sum California colon Florida. What it doesn't have is the cell address that we need, B5. We'll simply click B5 and enter. Same answer that we saw before, but look at the formula. Much shorter, much shorter. And it has the added advantage, if we add new sheets between California and Florida, we don't rewrite the formula at all. So if this were all of the states and they were alphabetized, this might read, for example, Alabama colon Wyoming, and then this. The interim view of the formula, oddly enough, did have a single quote in front of California and one out here behind Florida, but when we finally press enter, that's not there anymore. So we see this. So we're all set there. I'll complete that, not double click, but copy it down 2 more cells, and then to the right out there. And let's readjust our column widths. Click in the upper left corner. A quick way to adjust all column widths, double click any boundary between 2 column letters if you selected the entire worksheet, and all column widths are readjusted. So all of these cells here have those so-called 3D formulas, this time with that special kind of reference. Let me press Control tilde. We can see this. Can't quite see it all, of course, so I'll just make this one wider. There we go. So we're seeing the same kind of formula. Let me do that over again. Every time I do this in a live session, someone will say, do it over again. And I understand why, too. So let me press Control Z here and Control tilde. There we go. Okay, how do we create this? I'll do it one more time here. Start with Alt equal. Click the California sheet. With the Shift key held down, click Florida. Click cell B5. Enter. There it is, just like that. And I only made the column wider so we could see it clearly on the screen. That wasn't truly necessary. So there we go. That's going to save a ton of times. It also will encourage you in different situations to make worksheets have identical layouts. Now you can't always force that issue, but if you can, it really makes life easier, particularly in situations like this. If you have all the worksheets with the exact same layout. Another question that comes up from time to time in these formulas, and I've sort of dealt with one of them a little bit, if we add new states, we want to add them from within. If we only wanted to add up some of the states, you cannot use the Control key to pick selective states here. You'll just have to type in the sheet names in that case, perhaps, or work around it a different way, or maybe you use the formula the way we did the first time around. There's no quick way here if you only wanted to select some of the states. But this is really handy at times. If we move one of the sheets out of the loop, or out of the consecutive list here, if I were to move Texas and put it behind sheet 3, of course our totals would all be different, but we wouldn't have it made any change to these formulas at all. That would still say California to Florida, but it would only include New York between them if we had moved Texas off to the right, for example. So anytime we insert new sheets, we would want to insert them between California and Florida. And then at a later time, we could possibly move these around. And sure enough, in some situations, you might have to recreate the formula, but it's much easier to create a formula like this than the one we saw earlier where we had to click on all those different sheets. So great tools at times, and really powerful. I think you can see that too. Keep in mind too, there can be times when you simply want to get data from different states. If I simply want to get our total from California right here, I can type equal, click on the California sheet, click that total right there, and that's it. And the formula looks like this. Another way to do this, but I don't think it's better, and it certainly is longer, is to start at the source and copy the data. So I'm going to right click on this 18,000 number here in cell G8. In other words, you can right click and copy, or Control C, and then go to the destination, and right here paste special, Control Alt V, you could do that, and then paste link. You can do that too. So same idea. Now, one other thing you can do with data before we move into functions here, and I'll go back to the other workbook, and you can switch workbooks quickly with Control-Tab. If you have only 2 workbooks open, that's really handy to go back and forth by way of Control-Tab. You can also do this, of course, from the buttons on the View tab in the ribbon. So in this worksheet here, in this workbook here, there is a worksheet called Profits. Now, let's ignore maybe this section for the moment here. I'm going to highlight all these rows here, right-click and hide them. What if when you laid out the data here, you did it kind of quickly, and it's okay, nothing wrong with it, but then you're thinking ahead, and you're thinking, well, why not do this for the whole year? And maybe we'll rethink out our totals and averages and everything, but and you might be saying to yourself, you know, I should have probably put in the months down in column A and the sales, expenses, profits across row 3, something like that. Well, without disrupting this, let's consider how that might look. And you certainly don't want to do this manually, but let's highlight the data here and press Control-C to copy it. And then down here, certainly not overlapping it, I'm going to click on cell A21 here. Let's transpose the data. Imagine if you could imagine a diagonal line from the upper left to the lower right. If you could somehow rotate that. What we're going to do here is to go to Paste Special, Control-Alt-V, and choose Transpose, and click OK. And there's the same data this way, a little bit of column adjustment width there. Get that right. We've got the same numbers. You can see them clearly there. Same numbers. And furthermore, we've got formulas here. Here's the formula, the 1540. You see a 1540 up there. But up in cell H4 in the upper right, that 1540 is derived by adding the 6 numbers to its left. The formula gets transposed down here into B28. It's adding up the numbers from above. Now, you don't want to keep both of these probably, although you could. I think the idea is, hey, does this look better? You're the judge. If it does, yeah, good. We'll use this one. Throw away the old one. And there are any number of times when I look at certain worksheets, I think, how might that worksheet look if we transpose the data? Now, in some, it's pretty obvious. It's not going to work very well at all. At others, hadn't thought of it. Let's try it. Let's see what it looks like. And sometimes it's a disaster, and sometimes it's great, and a lot of in between. So not a bad idea. If this had been our starting point, if we transpose this, it's going to look like this. So you can go the other direction too. So transposing data. And by the way, this is very analogous to what some of you are familiar with in pivot tables, where we switch fields and end up, in a sense. You could say it here too. We're pivoting the data from the upper left-hand corner and flipping it sideways so that it looks like this. So it's a handy feature to have at your fingertips, and very easy to use. And it transposes the formulas as well. All right, let's go back to this first worksheet here. And we've got a column all set up here for bonuses. Now, one function that really changes the way you work with Excel is the if function. It's almost programming-like in nature. Many times it's simple, it's straightforward. However, it can be at different times complex. It opens the door to the idea of conditional thinking, or we'll use the word again in a different sense. What if? What if I did this? Or what if this is the situation? So this company has decided to give bonuses to people who have a job rating of 4 or 5. Now, because the if function often is long, and just in terms of the space it takes up, I'm going to make column K wider. Ultimately, we'll make it narrower again, but just so we see clearly what we're about to do here. In its simplest form, the if function will allow us to make a test. When the test is true, we'll have one answer. When it's false, we'll have another. So it's often just an either or situation. So all we're trying to check here is the job rating. So they're both visible on the screen, equal if. And there are two major ways we can say this. Notice also when you type in function names, after you provide the left parent, what you see below it is some pop-up tips. And it's really helpful. They give you sort of the kickstart for those functions where, maybe you've seen them once or twice, or you're not too familiar with them. It's handy. Now, if you've never seen the if function, at first you're not quite sure maybe what does logical test mean. Many times it means you're going to compare 2 cells to see which one is bigger, or you're going to compare a cell with a static value. but you can also compare a cell with a formula, compare two different formula results. You can check to see if it's a certain text entry and so on. Quite a few different ways to use this. In our example here, all we're checking is that cell J2 here is either greater than 3 or it's not. Now we can do this in two ways. Greater than 3. That's one way to do this. Another way, slightly different, is to say it's equal to or greater than 4. Or more likely people say it's greater than or equal to 4. So how do we do that? Like that. Now in this scenario, all the job ratings are whole numbers. So whether we say this, greater than or equal to 4, that of course means what? 4s and 5s are going to meet that match. If we say greater than 3, it meets the match there, 4s and 5s. So either way in this case, comma. And notice how the highlighting below switches to value if true. Okay, if this is true, what's our answer here? This company is going to give $2,500 bonuses, comma. And when it's false, what are they going to do? 0. Now, if you want to display 0, of course, you put in 0. If you'd like to display nothing, you put in double quote, double quote. It displays a blank. If you'd like to put in text, you can put it between the double quotes. You probably wouldn't do that if you were an HR professional, but you could. I'll just leave it blank by putting in that. We don't have to type the right pair in here. In a case like this, Excel will do it for us. I'm going to press Control-Enter because I don't want the active cell to move downward. I want it to stay in place because I want to copy this immediately. So I'll press Control-Enter, double-click the lower right-hand corner, and we see answers where the job rating is 4 and 5. Now I'm going to press F2 so we expose the formula. It isn't very long yet, but it could get longer, and it will. So simple little straightforward test here with the if function. And many, many times it's this simple, it's this straightforward. And I've only made the column wider because we're going to make the function longer, and we're going to see this as we play it out. And that first cell there, of course, we saw nothing. But let's expand the logic a little bit. The company has redecided and said, you know, if you do have a job rating of 3, you're not a top performer, but on the other hand, you know, you're doing okay, and we'll give you a smaller bonus. Now, what isn't so obvious is the logic really happens left to right. When this J2 is greater than 3, the answer is 2,500. The logic stops, the answer is entered, and that's it. We can't really watch our functions in that slowed down time frame. But when this test fails, the logic jumps behind that second comma. And in the example here, it simply puts in a blank. But what if we realize that at this point, the only job ratings that can be considered right now are 1s, 2s, and 3s. Let's put in another if. Now this is called a nested if. We want to check to see if the job rating equals 3, comma. And if it does equal 3, then we want the answer here to be 1,000, comma. And if not, blank. Now that's an if inside of an if. Remember, the logic only comes here when the job rating is 1, 2, or 3. So we're checking for it when it's 3, we're going to provide 1,000. Anybody who has a 4 or 5, the logic doesn't even come here. You've got your 2,500, that's it. So this is an if inside of an if. They're called nested ifs, but we do need a final parent. Notice how they're color-coded too. The inner parentheses here are red. So we do have to type the additional ones here for sure, looking like that. Now, since all these cells are highlighted below, I'll simply press Control-Enter. And I'll press F2 so we can see this again. But before I do, recognize that row 2 there, we see the answer is 1,000. Also in row 7. A nested if, an if inside of an if. Now, we could go a step further. Even though these 2s here aren't performing that well, we might give them a token, a very small bonus, maybe almost like a slap on the wrist to say, you know, get better here. Where would we put that? Well, just as we put this to the right of the previous if, how about another if right here? The goal is not to make this more complex. The goal is to meet our needs, and sometimes nested ifs get the job done. The most nested ifs you could have had in older versions of Excel until 2007 was 7 nested ifs. Now, we're about to approach the third one here, and this starts to get a little tricky maybe. If the job rating equals 2, comma, we'll give these people just $100. Otherwise, comma, nothing. That's an if inside of an if inside of an if. We need a third parent out there. You can type it anywhere out there in the midst of those parentheses. Doesn't make a difference where. Let's put it right there maybe, but there we go. So an if inside of an if inside of an if. Remember, maximum used to be 7, and because apparently a lot of people said give us more, we can now have up to 64 nested ifs. Now, as the phrase goes, don't go there. Don't try that unless you're trying to show off maybe. But here we got a situation. I'll press Control Enter, and we've got 4 different kinds of answers, or 4 different answer types: 2,500, 1,000, 100, or blank. And there's the function. Again, the goal is not to use more ifs, but to meet our needs, and sometimes you will see multiple nested ifs. And jokingly, sometimes as they get longer, these might be referred to as job security formulas. Everybody has to keep coming back to you because you're the one who created it, and it's very complex. And now, ultimately, for those who work with if functions a lot, this is not that involved. I don't mean to suggest that you're going to be in that situation, but sometimes these are quite long. We don't need to keep the column width that wide, but again, we're trying to show what this will look like better. So different examples here of using nested ifs. Now, I want to switch directions though and bring in a different concept though. Sometimes the actual test is more complex than is something greater than or something equal to, something like that. Sometimes it's going to have multiple criteria. So off to the left here, I've got some other columns. I want to keep the years of service, that's column G in view, and also the status, but I don't really need to see column I, so for the moment I'm just going to hide that. Right click and hide that. And I'll make the column even wider here. Let's change the direction. The company has changed its mind. Let's say it's reverting back to an earlier example, but with a variation. The company is now saying we only give bonuses to full-time people, and they must have a good job rating. So let's clean this out a little bit here. We'll take out some of the parentheses on the right and take out this chunk of it right here and redesign. We're still not quite there yet. So here's what we'd like to say. You've got to have a good job rating, and you must be full-time. So I'm going to put the word "and" here, maybe surprisingly, if you've never seen it, in front of J2 greater than 3, comma, and the status, that's H2, equal, and because it's text, we have to put it in double quotes. Double quote, and by the way, that's not the single quote character hit twice. It's the double quote character. You have to use the shift key on it. Full-time. Oddly enough, upper lowercase isn't critical, but the spacing certainly is. All uses of the full-time in column H have a space between full and time, so we've got to do it here too. Okay, here's what we're saying in English. Now, what's strange at first is the word "and" is outside the parentheses. Why isn't it between the conditions? The reason it isn't is that we can have many, many conditions, up to 31 different criteria in here. And putting the word "and" in repeatedly between all of them would really be overwhelming after a point. So read it as if your job rating is greater than 3 and your status is full-time, and only when both of those are true, but when they're both true, you get $2,500. Otherwise, nothing. So think of "and" as being, taking the place of this comma if you want to read it that way. But we could have a third criterion, a fourth, a fifth, but instead of using the word "and" over and over and over again, we put it outside the parent. As we type it, it doesn't have to be uppercase. Later, it will become that. So let's say we complete this. I'll press Control Enter. And as we're expecting in the first case here, this person will not get any bonus because that person does not have the high enough job rating. But we'll double click and see where others might. See what's happening. In row 4, you can see good job rating and full-time status. Row 6, the same thing, so on. Row 8, let's see. Well, that's not at all involved. Got another one. Well, row 10, job rating 5, that's good, but doesn't have full-time status. So once again, clicking up here and redisplaying it with F2, there we are. That's what it's looking like. Within context too, these do make sense pretty readily. Now you don't always know what to type, but when you see certain examples, I think you can say, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. And keep in mind, when you're working with your own data, you certainly have a feel for it. You have some instincts about what the answers should be many times, and these fall into place maybe more readily than you might think. Now, let's take this in a slightly different direction. I think you would know what the answer would be here, but another word in the same category as and another function. I meant to say too, sometimes this could be a standalone function. It'll simply give us an answer, true or false. Out of the 4 possibilities, it's only true once. That's when both of these are true. And remember earlier I mentioned when you're debugging formulas, you can highlight a portion of the formula to find out if it's true or false. So we know in this case, this portion here is false. I can press F9. This portion right here is true. But those two together, and we'll highlight these, that's going to be false. Let me escape to get out of here. So that debugging tool can be helpful in situations like this. So we're back here again. So if we change this to or, it means that either condition is true. And so then out of the 4 possibilities that we have here, the true, true, false, etc., all those different combinations, there are 4 possibilities, and now 3 of them are true when either one of these is true. Now, as I press Control-Enter to change all these, keep an eye on the answers. We're going to have a lot more happy people around. Or is it that many? I didn't change it. Hold on. There we go. Let's come back. As I change this to or, so let's go back to here. As soon as I press Control-Enter, keep an eye on column K, we'll see that all these entries, well, not all of them, but we're going to have a lot more happy people as I complete this with Control-Enter. There we go. So now in either case, so in row 2, for example, that person is full-time, gets the bonus automatically. In fact, and whoever's doing this might question the wisdom of all this. In row 11, we've got a full-time person with a job rating of 1 who's still getting the bonus. So, nevertheless, the thought here really is what are we doing logically? We are saying if this condition is true or this condition is true, and we don't care which one, or we don't care if both are, that's fine. If either one or both are true, the answer is 2,500. So again, when you see these in context, a lot of times it makes perfect sense. Now, let's change it a little bit differently though, and make it go a different direction. The company's reconsidered after some comment about some of this, and they've said, okay, if you have a good job rating, we're going to give you a bonus. But if you don't, you might have that right combination of being full-time and having been here many years. So how about an and inside of an or? If you're full-time, comma, and your years of service is greater than 9. So if you're 10 or more years is another way to say it. So that's an and inside of an or. We've got to get our extra parentheses out there too. Either you have a good job rating or you've got the right combination of being full-time and over 9 years of service. So I'll complete that entry and double click. And it looks like on the screen not a whole lot has changed, although some of these certainly have. And we can see in some cases here, this hourly person here didn't get the bonus before when it was an and, but now does. And the reason there is that person has a good job rating automatically. Didn't really make any difference how many years of service. That person has a good job rating, we got it. But this full-time person down here is getting a bonus because even though the job rating is not good, has the right combination of being full-time and more than 9 years of service. We can see that happening there. So these can go in a lot of different directions, and you can begin to see, again, what's critical here is when it's your data, or when you understand the data, these are easier to understand and easier to create. But you do need examples like this. I think it's really good to have one of those major books on Excel, one of those 1,000 pagers, because you'll often see some good and lengthy examples of the if function, and how many times the or function, the and function are used together with this. Keep in mind, even though they are often standalone functions, many times they're used with the if function in situations like this. Now, I want to show you another variation on an if function, and we're not going to do much with this. Now, suppose if this is all we wanted to do with column K, and as we could have been doing all along, I'll simply double-click the boundary between K and L, and that's a more likely scenario as to how we would make this appear. We'd probably format the numbers too, of course. Now, I've got a different worksheet here called Profits, which we saw earlier. I've got a different worksheet here called Find Formulas, which we saw earlier. And there's a formula in here that's it needs some work, and this worksheet has been sent to you. Just looking it over, and as you double click on cell B1 right here, as I'm doing, suddenly you're appalled. Now, there's a little tip, a formatting tip that's going to apply here. At first, it might not seem like it. You may or may not know that if you're typing in certain kinds of text entries, say it's a column heading, if you've got more than a few words, you're thinking, well, the column's going to be pretty wide, but the data below it's not very wide at all. So a simple little example might be here. Maybe I'm putting in salaries for next year. So I type in 2015. I want the word salary to be under this, but within the same cell. I'll press Alt-Enter and type salary and enter. Looks like that. That's easy. That's fast. So what does that got to do with formulas? I'm going to double click again on cell B1 right here. Now, I'm editing this right now. Without changing what this formula is doing, I'm going to click in front of this second if right here and press Alt-Enter. That introduces line break, just like it did in that label down in cell B47. And then in front of this if right here, I'll do the same thing, Alt-Enter, and in front of the next one. Now, I don't instantly understand what's going on all of a sudden. I'll do it in front of the first one too. But the structure, the way this is being displayed, at least I can sit down with a cup of coffee or whatever else it is I drink and say, well, you know, okay, let's figure this out a little bit. Now, ultimately, in this example here, if you were to analyze this, it could be done more efficiently. We're not going to worry about that. But the point is, you can pick this apart more readily. You can begin to see the structure of it. The parentheses are color-coded. I wouldn't wish this on anybody, by the way, but still, I've seen these and longer ones at times. And it's not necessarily a badge of honor to say that I just wrote a 7 nested if function or something like that. No, but remember too, when you're doing this too, we can find out at a glance, is that true? Is that part of it true? Let's highlight it and press F9. No, it's false. Okay, now maybe you're expecting true, maybe not, but the point is you can evaluate this in pieces if you wish. Remember, I can press Control Z if I want, move on and highlight other portions too, or highlighting increasing portions too. I'll press F9, does that, and highlight this chunk right here, and do the same kind of thing at different times here. Oops, I pressed Control Tab there by mistake. So whoa, there we are. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, that could be helpful too. I'm going to press Escape here. We won't proceed. We won't worry about that particular formula. So the if function is no doubt really powerful. I think you can see that. It does have its limitations, and sometimes formulas are incredibly long. You can see the formula, how long it is there too, up in the formula bar. All right, let's move back to the HR list here. Recently I saw, and I'm not sure who did the actual analysis, but the most frequently Googled function regarding Excel is Vlookup. It's one of the most important functions. At least one Excel author, an author of one of the major 1,000-page books on Excel, has said flat out, I don't know how you can prove this exactly, but I don't doubt it really, Vlookup is the most important function in Excel. Well, let's say it depends, but there's no question that it's the ideal tool for matching up data out of different worksheets. Now, it sounds kind of vague maybe, but in this scenario here, we're talking about the possibility of coming up with more complex answers here than we might with an if function. If you've mastered the if function, if you work with it heavily, suppose you had to come up with a situation where you need to calculate a tax rate here. Now, off to the right, I've got some columns. What I'd like to do momentarily is hide columns P, Q, and R, and right-click and hide, get them out of the way. What if we had to look up the tax rate based on the compensation amounts we see here? Now, we know in our day-to-day use of our tax system, it's never this simple, of course, but let's just say maybe these are the adjusted rates or whatever. We're simply looking up a simple, maybe it's the state tax rate or something, based on the fact that we've got a table over here. Now, in Excel, when you're trying to match up information with other information, it's not uncommon to be working across multiple worksheets, sometimes even in different workbooks. But the idea of looking up information in a table is also quite common. And off to the right here, I've got a table of data oriented vertically. And then farther to the right, that same data oriented horizontally. And just by seeing the two side by side, I think you can begin to see that tables are more likely to be structured vertically. Now, that's not a flat out rule or anything. And in my experience, it seems like about 3/4 of the tables of data, tables of this style, let's say, are oriented vertically, more like this. Now, the two functions that we might consider using here, and they're much more powerful than the if function and much easier to use, are called Vlookup, think of V for vertical, Hlookup, H for horizontal. And as I said many, many times, the tables you're referring to are located on different worksheets. But if at all possible, if you need to look up information from different worksheets, if you could somehow take those tables, put them on the same worksheet, it's likely to be easier when you're setting it up. Now, as you gain confidence and use these more often, perhaps that's less critical. I'm also going to delete column S here just to move this over a little bit to the left. There we are. See our data this way. Now, is the if function workable here? Even if you're a whiz at the if function, I think you begin to realize here it's going to be almost unthinkable. We could use the if function to say, in effect, with a long structured nested if like we just saw, we're going to compare this value with this one. Is it bigger? Yes. Is it bigger? Yes. Keep going. Finally, we reach our conclusion here. We'd have to have probably 11, 10 nested ifs here. Almost unthinkable, unworkable. Now, thinking outside of Excel for the moment, if you saw a value like this and you had to refer to this table, what answer would you come up with? Would you use the logic that says, well, this 53,000 has not reached, or let's say you could say it's closer to 55,000, therefore it's 8%. Or another bit of logic might say, well, it hasn't reached this level, therefore it's 7%. The Vlookup function uses the latter logic. Perhaps it's similar to the way we look up information in a tax table. If you're actually doing your own tax, you come up with a final number here. Maybe that's your adjusted gross or something. Many times you compare with a list. If it hasn't reached the next level, then it's here. The Vlookup function is designed to compare a value with the left column of a table. So in this scenario here, the idea would be, as soon as we see a value that's too large, we backtrack, and then by way of Vlookup, we will indicate we want our answers to come out of the second column here, not the first one on the left, but the second one on the right. So we expect ultimately to get a 7% as our answer here, and in this example here, the second example here, we will not have reached the 75,000 level, therefore the tax rate is 10%. Now, Vlookups come in two major types. Sometimes you need to look up data exactly. For example, it's somebody's name, it's a social security number, it's an ID number. It must be exact. All examples of text lookups, when it relates to tables, they must be an exact match kind of lookup. If it's an ID number, it has to be an exact match. What we're doing here is something called an approximate match. In other words, we don't expect to see any of these salaries match up exactly. Now, theoretically, one of them might, but none of them do. But the idea is that we're looking between the numbers, so to speak. So this is a certain kind of VLOOKUP, an approximate match lookup. The exact match we'll see in a bit. And depending upon who you are and what you do, exact matches might be much more common. Here too, I'm going to make the column wider to show the result a little bit better. And we'll use Vlookup. Vlookup is much more commonly used than HLOOKUP. The mechanics of the two are very similar. And I'll show you two ways to do this, and we will be referring back to that idea of using column references. Equal Vlookup, left parenthesis. Here's the value we're looking up, M2, comma. Here's this table. Now, if it's on a different worksheet, you will want to click that worksheet and then go highlight the cells. Comma, which column of the table has the answers? Now, literally, it's column T, but we use column numbers. Column S is the first column in the table. Column T is the second column. So we put in the number 2. And that's all we need to do in cases of approximate match. Now, in these examples for an approximate lookup, column S must be in ascending order for us to get coherent answers. So I'm going to press enter here, actually control enter so it doesn't move. That's our answer. Double click, the answer is correct, and we've got a problem. So what didn't I do here? As soon as I click one of these down here, I think you'll see. I didn't make that reference absolute. So we have to do that. But while we're here, and let me actually backtrack with Control Z, just go do it this way. Let's change the format of it too. That's not super critical, but on the Home tab, why not make it be %? Or we could have done Control Shift % sign. Let's change this. We want to make sure that our reference here is absolute. So we highlight these cells and press F4. Enter. There we are. And now we can double click. Now, it just so happens that the example here too uses data in column S, and the S's and the $signs, particularly if you zoom back and are looking at this, kind of blur together. Nothing wrong with that, and we did do the correct thing here in making those absolute. We've got correct answers. You can check them all out. They work just fine. And that certainly is a viable solution. However, this is not the easiest thing to read. Again, you get used to it and all that, but the S's and the $signs kind of blur together, and that's just the way it is. There's a different approach, something we suggested earlier. Instead of the reference here, looking like that, what if we simply drag across columns S and T? That's a lot easier to read. And furthermore, since we're only copying this down the same column, we don't need to worry about an absolute reference. So let me press enter here. I'm going to press Control tilde so we can see the two side by side. You can see in N2 and N3 how much easier that top one is to read. Now, if you're still somewhat new with the notation, that's okay. But on the other hand, that's simpler, that's easier. I'll press Control tilde again so we go back to the normal view. And I'll simply double click to copy this down the column, and all of our answers are going to be the same. That's it. It's working, and it's working here, and so on. Same answers. Again, it's critical in absolute or approximate match situations. These must be in ascending order. Now, the odd thing is, when they're not, you still get a lot of believable answers, and a lot of them might be correct too. I'm going to change the 35 here to be an 85. Now, you know that's going to trigger some differences, but as I press enter, let's keep an eye on these numbers here. I'm not sure how many of these are going to change. Maybe not very many. I didn't see any of them changing. But surely somewhere in here, some of them have changed. So you got to be on top of that. That's easily overlooked. You might say, well, this looks like it's all working. Check out the numbers here. They must be in ascending order for us to get good, correct answers. So I imagine a number in the 35,000 range there might be off somewhere. This one here, maybe 36, that's 5%. What should that have been? Well, we can't really tell from there, but yeah, that should have been 6%. Not a huge difference really, but still be very on top of that idea. So I'll press Control Z to undo that. This is an example of an approximate match. Now, in some scenarios, maybe that's what you use most often, but an exact match where we're working either with text or with ID numbers, we've got to see an example of that too, because it does work differently. And the way we use it differently might be a little surprising, at least at first. Here's a list, a table to the left here. And I think you can figure out pretty quickly what's going on. We've got some ratings here, and we've got some numerical scores associated with each rating. Here's a list of names. We've got some ratings. And off to the right here, I put in a VLOOKUP. It's all set, except that answer is wrong. Fair should not be 50. It should be a 71. So everything so far in this VLOOKUP is accurate. We're comparing cell E2, contains the word fair, with the table over in columns A and B. And we want to get our answers out of the second column. That's all well and good. Now, let me make column C a little bit narrower and zoom in on this because you want to see this large and clear. If you've never seen what we're about to do here first, it might surprise you a bit. If we need an exact match, after putting in the column reference, we type comma, and then the pop-up says true for approximate match, false for exact match. False? Exact match? Why would we ever type false? Well, we do. I'm going to click this and tab it into place. You could have typed it. False means it's got to be exact match. Now, using all your powers of intuition and insight, would you have ever guessed that false means exact? I surely wouldn't. I don't think anybody else would either. Now, as an alternate, you can use 0. Is that any more logical? Hardly. It is less typing. The other advantage it has, by the way, is it will be the same code or the same indicator that's used when we use the match function. The match function for an exact match uses 0. So I often use 0. But 0 or false is what we use here. But neither one is intuitive, of course, but that's what we do when we want to make sure this is an exact match. So when we complete this, we will get a 71. And as I double click to copy this downward, we're going to get all the others as well too. So anytime you've got an exact match, and that means all text examples or all ID type number examples where it must be perfect. Remember, social security numbers, close enough is not good enough. It's got to be exact. That would have to be an exact match scenario, as all these are here too. And in a certain sense, and we know that column A is not in alphabetical order, is not in any other kind of order. It's based on the order of what's really in column B. But VLOOKUP only makes comparisons with the left column. It gets its answers out of usually other columns, although it could even get them out of the first one. But nevertheless, VLOOKUP is going to compare these words with what it sees in column A, and then we get our answers out of column B. That's the second column. That's what the 2 means. 0, or we could have used false, means exact match. Now, in these scenarios, if we've got misspellings, we've got problems. Or if somebody says, you know, Kit Carson, your performance was just plain lousy. Well, we don't have lousy in our list, so we're going to get something like this from time to time. And furthermore, what happens, and this is what we often don't have control over when we get data from other sources, on George Babbitt up here, I'm going to double click in the cell where we see the word fair and put a space behind fair. Doesn't work. Or down here with Norman Bates down here, between very and good, I'll put in multiple spaces. We've got problems. There is a workaround for these. Not for the lousy, because we just can't do anything there. Somebody suggested in the class once, can Excel in the future look up this word in a dictionary and see that it really means poor? I kind of doubt that. Anyway, let's go back to here. A workaround here that could help. The long-term solution for situations where you've got trailing, and by the way, leading spaces, here's another one. I'll put in a leading space right there. Problem. Clean up the data. Now, you don't always have the luxury of doing that, but eventually you should. I'm going to use the function called trim. Trim will strip off trailing spaces, leading spaces, and if you have multiple consecutive interspaces, like we do down in row 11, it's going to take care of those as well too. So I'm going to change this to trim and then recopy. And all those are cleaned up except for the lousy, which just can't do anything with that one. But all the others here, this is how it's looking. We are now comparing the trim version. Trim, as I said, takes off any trailing spaces. We have the trailing space behind the letter R in there. That's eliminated, and then the comparison is made. In the example here, it takes off the leading space, and down here, it collapses those multiple interspaces to one space, then makes the comparison. So it's not uncommon when you're using exact matches to sometimes need to use the trim function. So Two examples here. The latter could be more important than the previous one, but this is an example here of an exact match. In an exact match, the Vlookup function has 4 arguments, or parameters as they're sometimes called, to it. What we're looking up, the location of the table, which could be in a different worksheet, the column of the table that has the answer, and whether it's exact match or not. 0 or false means exact match. If you put in the word true, which isn't necessary, it means approximate match, and it's the default, so we don't need to put it in. And we didn't use it when we saw that earlier example of a VLOOKUP. Let me go back to that momentarily too, because while we're here looking at this, if we had used the other horizontal table to the right, the V, of course, would have been an H. It would have had a different location, to be sure, but the 2 would have been the same. The 2 would mean the second row of the horizontal table, so it would stay the same, but it would mean row if this were an H lookup. And of course, with an H lookup, we couldn't use row references unless that table was somehow in a row where there was no other data at all. So once again, rephrasing that concept, that idea, VLOOKUPs are much more common. Now, I wanted to also point out here too, in either of these tables, if we had data in another worksheet, so for example, suppose I'm in a different worksheet completely. I'll just pick an adjacent one maybe, or one out here somewhere maybe. Let's go to this one maybe. Suppose in this worksheet I've got a salary somewhere, and I'm saying, I wonder what the tax rate for that salary is. Equal VLOOKUP, left parenthesis, here's the value, comma. Where's that table? I'm going to go to the other table on a different worksheet, click the worksheet, use the column type reference, drag across here, comma. I want to get the answers out of the second column, so I'll type a 2 and enter. 11%, that's the tax rate, adjusted. So what's the formula look like? The only difference is, and that's a short named worksheet, but all I did was to click on the other worksheet and refer to the appropriate column. So looking up data out of a different worksheet, not uncommon. Always at first, or many times, looks funny because you got a sheet reference in there with an exclamation point. Now, there could be times also, referring back to this other worksheet, there could be times when maybe you can use a VLOOKUP, but there's another function here that's kind of related to these. It's called choose. Now, here we've got a bunch of dates, and we simply want to know what the fiscal quarter is. What a mathematician might do is what we see right here. And that's just fine, and it works. And sometimes what we do is, yeah, our buddy Bob down the hall gave us this, works fine, I'll use it. I'm not going to figure it out, fine. But sometimes you want your functions to be readable and workable. How about a different way to do this? There's a function called choose. Now, you could jokingly say this is like a poor man's VLOOKUP. The choose function allows us to choose answers, but the table is actually embedded in the function. So what I'm going to do here is to say, let's pull the month out of cell H2. Here's a simple little function that simply will give us the monthly number, in this case 9, out of there. Now, when this answer is a 1, we want the fiscal year quarter to be quarter number 1, January. And if it's February, it's 1. And if it's March, it's 1. But then if it's April, 2, I think you get the idea here, 3 2s, 3 3s, and 3 4s. Now, that's not exactly obvious at first, but it's easy to read. We're not referring to any external table. All we're doing is extracting the month. Now, if I highlight this right now and press F9, you'll see a 9 because that's the month of September. You see it right there. So when the answer is 9, we go to our 9th result out here, which is right there, this number 3. That's the one it's going to pick up because this is the 9th entry. So let me press Control Z here and then enter. And so I copy these down the column. I'll just drag it this time. There we go. Those are the correct answers. We're getting the correct fiscal quarter. The mathematician's going to get the same answer as we got. Same answers in all cases, but I think you can see here, particularly if I bring this back and press Control tilde here. And probably have to make that column wider to see it. The second answer, even though it's a longer function, is more understandable to a lot of people. Just different ways, different thoughts here on how we can look up information. Choose is simply a workaround. It requires no external table. A lot about VLOOKUP, and I want to give you some more examples of how you might use this feature. In this particular worksheet here, we've got a list of names, salaries, and also dependents. And in the table to the right, we see the list here, or we see a table of salaries. And depending upon how many dependents you have, your tax rate changes. Now, if only our real tax system were this simple. I'm not trying to make an editorial statement here, but I think for purposes of demonstrating VLOOKUP, this is the kind of situation you might run into sometimes. Maybe it's not a tax rate, or it could be a state tax rate with lower amounts and so on, but we need to come up with the tax rate for Gale Black. And thinking outside of Excel just for the moment, I think what most of us would say is, okay, Gail makes almost 67,000, so we'd be looking down column F, and since he or she has not reached the 70,000 level, we're looking at the numbers right in here. And how many dependents does Gail have? 2. Therefore, it's going to be 13.4%. 2 dependents here. Now, if you work with VLOOKUP, you know that the kind of VLOOKUP we're trying to use here is not called an exact match. We're not trying to match up this salary exactly. So this kind of a function, or this kind of a use of VLOOKUP, is called an approximate match. Now I can zoom in a little bit. Let's say we want to be able to see a lot of that, but not necessarily all of it for the moment. So there we are. Equal VLOOKUP. The amount we're looking up is in cell B2, comma, and I'll do this 2 ways. The table that we're using here to look information up in is right here. I'm going to go highlight the cells like that. Now, tricky part in this use of VLOOKUP is, which column do we need? Now, Gale Black has 2 dependents. We know if we were working with just that data there, we could put in the number 3 and get a correct answer. Let me rephrase. Let's strike that a little bit and I'll start over. If we are looking at just Gale Black, the answer here is going to be 4. It's going to be in the 4th column. In other words, we're looking at column I right here. We're looking down the column here, and next to the 65,000, 13.4%. We could type in a 4 if we were only working with that one person, but we're not. And the next person down, Barry Bolte, has 4 dependents, and so if it's Barry Bolte, the column number we need is 6. Remember, column numbering starts from the left. The first number in the table, the first column number, is column F. That's column 1. Column G is column 2. Column H is column 3, and so on. And what you have to do in situations like this is use your own logic and come up with this conclusion. I think you wouldn't disagree. The column number that we need for Gale Black is 4. Therefore, it's 2 greater than dependents. If we look at Barry Bolte, if we were doing just that one alone, we'd need column 6, reading from left to right. So that also is 2 greater than the number of dependents. And same thing with Ron Booth. I think you quickly realize what's going on here. The column number that we need is 2 greater than the number of dependents. Now, there's nobody out there telling you that. If you went into an Excel book, you might not see an example like this. And so there will be times when you just have to put together the logic that's making sense to you. I think if you've worked with VLOOKUP for a bit, or if you work with Excel formulas, you probably have kind of an instinct that you know this can be done. Maybe it seems a little elusive at times, but we'll get there. So what do? We're going to use C2, that's the number of dependents, plus 2. And hopefully we're going to be seeing 13.4% here. And that's what we got. And I'll just drag this down a few cells just to check it out and make sure. Okay, how about Barry Bolte here, making 56,000. That means we're going to get data out of this row right here. It happens to be in row 12, but it's next to the 55,000 because he has not reached the 56,000 level. 4 dependents, there we are right there. And right at the intersection, we see that 7.0%, and that's what we're getting here, and so on. Now, what's happening down here? Are we getting this right? When I highlighted the range here, maybe that was luck that I got it right the second time. And that's a reminder, too, that sometimes you say, okay, it's working perfectly. But how about Ron Booth? Is that working okay? That's 46,000, so we're looking in here. and one dependent, that's working too. Are we just lucky here or what? And how about in this case here, 66,000? Because these numbers are farther down the list, this will work for a while. But if I drag this a few more cells downward, at some point here, we're going to start getting funny answers or wrong answers. I think you can see what's going on there. How about Judy here making only 8%? Does she have some kind of a special deal? She makes 91,000. So again, a strong reminder, when you're using these addresses, you're going to have to make them absolute. So I'll do that. Make just the reference to the table absolute by pressing the function key F4. This is, of course, after highlighting that range. Makes the formula look more complex, denser, and all that. I'll press Control-Enter and double-click the lower right-hand corner. And actually, I could go down to the bottom and double-click the lower right-hand corner again to copy these all the way down the column. So we've got correct answers now, and these are working in all cases. But again, in situations like this, don't always count on the logic falling into place automatically. Sometimes you've got to think it out a little bit. Now, as I recommended in the earlier course too, a lot of times it's going to be easier and better if you use column references here, entire column references. So instead of all this, I'm going to drag across columns F through M and press Control-Enter, getting the same answer. I might drag down a few just to make sure it's working okay. We want to be seeing the same numbers here. That's 7, 10, 10, and 13. We are, and so on. Now, a quick press of Control-tilde. This will display formulas. We can see side by side. That notation style, much easier to read as we look at these than the ones where we have the longer addresses. So many, many times we can use entire columns in references. The larger point to be made here, though, is this idea that when you're using VLOOKUP at certain points, you do need to create the logic or come up with the logic that's going to serve you best to come up with the correct answers here. So once again, we're looking at a formula like this using VLOOKUP. All right, that finishes today's session on formulas and functions. There's a second part to this. Some of you will be watching that. We talked about some basic ideas, some shortcuts in working with formulas and functions, and got involved much more heavily, of course, in the if function and also VLOOKUP. Two really important functions as you work with Excel. So thank you all for watching. This is Dennis Taylor.